Okay, we have to kind of start on time because we have a very full schedule. So the first speaker is going to be Kristen from the University of British Columbia. She's a program officer for the Canadian International Resources and Development Institute and doctoral fellow with the University of British Columbia's Forest and Conservation Science Department. Her research and practices focus broadly on human-environment interactions with a special interest in natural resource governance and international development.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the warm introduction, as well as being invited to this event. And thank you, of course, to the government of Mongolia for making this event possible. So, as just a brief disclaimer, I have a few slides just about the Canadian International Resources and Development Institute, because we're a new institute formed at the University of British Columbia that's actually a coalition of universities established about 3 years ago. And I'll focus predominantly on political ecology of transboundary resource governance in Mongolia and beyond. As well as some of our colleagues have talked quite a bit about the issue of water scarcity, I'll be focusing predominantly on governance systems of water management, as well as chemical pollution from mining. So just a quick overview of our institute. Our mission is to improve in a measurable way the ability of developing countries to manage and benefit from their extractive sectors in order to catalyze sustainable economic growth and reduce poverty. So really looking at the intersection between poverty alleviation and extractives. And of course, integrated resource management, and particularly water, is a very important part of our programming. These are our current countries of engagement, and as well, we'll hear probably more from our other University of British Columbia colleagues on an active project we have in Mongolia, and CIRDI has had long engagement with the government of Mongolia. So, discussing mining, water, and Mongolian livelihoods is a very complex and interesting, nuanced issue, because Mongolia, of course, because of its abundant mineral resources, has seen prolific impacts on its fragile ecosystems, and many of those are climate-vulnerable landscapes, as we've heard today. So since 1992, Mongolia has had periodic waves of foreign direct investment, and rapid expansion of the mineral sector has unleashed, as we know, a number of ecological as well as social problems which are linked. And despite the mining boom and its periodic cycles of boom and bust, benefits are unequal. And we see that there's deepening rural poverty as well as environmental degradation is disproportionately felt by rural populations. The water and mining nexus is a central political issue in Mongolia at local, national, as well as regional scales. So and in my own experience of working in Mongolia in over 19 IMAGs, I had the experience of working a lot with grassroots initiatives that were very, very politicized about the issue of water. And so advocacy and awareness, you can see in the last decade, has definitely been increasing. And there's a strong desire to decentralize water management down to the local level, but there are inherent struggles with trying to accomplish that goal. And so I'll focus on really the political scale of this issue. And when we think about Mongolia, we often think of iconic landscapes that look such as this. This is the Okhron Valley, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But as we know, when you talk about the issue of water in Mongolia, it's hard to make generalizations because overall precipitation is heterogeneous in space and time. So for a stark contrast, this is also an iconic Mongolian landscape, obviously that's challenged by issues of water scarcity. And in the Gobi, as Sara discussed earlier, of course, is becoming an increasing issue that is risen to the top of the political agenda. Now, this map here is not nearly as nuanced or as nice as the map that we were shown in terms of one of the previous presenters, Dr. Hessl. But really what it's trying to communicate is that there's a strong precipitation gradient that you see in Mongolia. And so the issue of river management, water management, and the whole dialogue around that really has a very important sense in terms of where its geographic location is in the country. And this is governed a lot by annual precipitation as well as the snowpack and other sorts of water use, land use conflicts that exist, largely driven by the mineral and agriculture sector. So Mongolia has I say 6,000 with a star because it's very difficult to actually have a good estimate, because Mongolia, of course, is such a large country, and although many surveys on the topic of water has become a very hot topic, particularly for political ecology, we really don't know how many rivers there are. So this is an estimate of about 6,000, and we do know that 210 flow directly transboundary into both China and the Russian Federation. So also when we talk about mining, I think that there's another important issue of scale. Often we talk about in Mongolia the large-scale mining impacts, Tavan Tolgoi, Oyu Tolgoi, but the lesser known is actually the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, or ninja mining, that I'll speak to a little bit more with one of my case studies. But the purpose of really thinking about the impacts on water quality and quantity is that this is an issue felt very much at the local level, which has become a national priority, and we're seeing now that actually there is a definite concern about transboundary resource conflicts, not only with China, but also with Russia. So, looking in the post-Soviet context of water governance in Mongolia, the process of decentralization really requires rescaling, both of policies, assessments, and institutions. And water governance, inherently political issue, and the politics of scale and related transboundary conflicts, both in Mongolia and beyond, will be discussed. And overall, institutionalizing river basin management in Mongolia has really been an ongoing negotiation process, not only with a transitioning political landscape as well as legal frameworks that have really changed throughout the 2000s, and we continue to see that trajectory today, but really a focus of integrated resource management and focusing on multiple stakeholders' dialogue and engagement has been a central focus of a lot of my own work at the community level and working with the national government. So the politics of scale approach, or what does that mean and why, is actually just really looking at how we measure things and at what scale. And that's in terms of both management, monitoring, and governance. So myself, I'm a hydrogeologist, so when I think of scales of assessment and river basins, for me it always starts with spatial scale of a plot level. Where do we actually go and conduct our assessments? And although our plot level assessments and experimental watersheds is predominantly where scientists have quite a strength, unfortunately, in many cases with basin river management, that is the management scale where decision-making actually happens. And so what we see is that there's actually a bit of a disconnect between the science that informs policy, and there's an interesting engagement between the two. So really what the definition of scales from a scientific perspective is that from remote sensing and GIS and satellite imagery and all of these modern tools that we have, we can easily delineate water boundaries, but that's a very political process. And so, just thinking in that multi-scale theme, water governance at multiple scales in Mongolia, I use this in the Gobi. This picture here is a local level issue because this herder, and this was his last camel. All of them had actually basically either starved to death or had had issues because he could not provide enough crops for them, which was very much a localized issue. But as I said, precipitation is so heterogeneous in Mongolia. In the north, in areas such as Hofskol, Salang, other areas, there's a myth of abundance of water, where water quantity is less of a concern. And so this is just basically showing the issue that it occurs at multiple spatial scales. Okay. So, and talking about how you actually manage this in a population base that's one of the lowest densities on Earth, and how do you actually commit to that political will of promoting decentralization to the local level and supporting local level management? Because in Mongolia as well, community benefit agreements are now enshrined in law, and so how you engage in a participatory manner of monitoring and evaluating the quality of resources has been an issue that I've had the opportunity to work with quite a bit through the Asia Foundation of training local populations to engage in participatory water management in order to have more understanding about the value of their own resources, but also to just make sure that there's a common understanding about the challenges associated with mineral development, as well as water quality and quantity. So, river basin organizations in Mongolia have mandates and responsibilities that were assigned, and a crucial factor of this effort of scale to deal with the river basin scale. So in Mongolia's 2004 water law, it really adopted this this integrated water management approach, which we've seen historically. This has been a common trend of many organizations, as well as governments promoting this integrated river basin approach. So what it called for, which caused a number of problems, in order to start supporting basin management, you had to delineate them, which, as I said before, from a scientific perspective, seems quite simple. The point there is this, that the delineation, because of multiple users of water resources, is inherently a political issue as well as an economic issue, and very much associated with power. So really looking at what happened in terms of a brief overview of legislation here is previous legislation, although it delineated a new approach for water management in Mongolia, it didn't really empower or galvanize local communities to actually engage or provide any fiscal regulatory mechanisms to support this in the long term, creating problems. So what we see is since about 2009, there was a proliferation of interest in water, and a number of NGOs, CSOs, and other sorts of community-based resource management groups that really galvanize support around the issue of water. Unfortunately, many of these and some river movement organizations, one that I have worked with, the United Movement of Mongolian Rivers and Lakes, and a colleague, Munkbayar, was very, very political about mining and water issues. And I think that in a way that actually provided a bit of a negative lens from the government's perspective of how community action should actually be supporting resource governance in the extractives. So in 2012, Sara also indicated this, it was a huge advance forward, not only for the issue of river basin organizations, but just really thinking about how to adequately support a transparent management procedure of managing water resources. But as she touched on as well, it's inherently difficult for foreign researchers to access some of this information. So the river basins of Mongolia now have been delineated and were approved through the 2012 law. This is from World Wildlife Fund in Mongolia, and this work was originally done in 2010. But what's interesting about this map is what you see here is not actually the physical boundaries of the watersheds. They required an economic, political, land use, and all sorts of other considerations well beyond just those of the hydrogeology. And this rather busy slide basically shows a political breakdown of how the chain of command and at what scale how decision-making and authority occurs in Mongolia. So you can see at the national level that there are a number of water committees and a water council that promotes interministerial coordination. In post-Soviet context, in 1986, the original centralized water authority was dismantled, and then there was a bit of a challenge of water is a cross-cutting issue, so who should be responsible for it and how should it really be managed? And as an extension of that, and thinking about this issue of scale, we can see that on the axis here, it basically goes from community, district, province, or IMAG, all the way up to the national, and maps all of the various stakeholders that are involved in this process. However, we can see that the Ministry of Environment is predominantly responsible for a lot of the environmental monitoring and compliance. And as one of our other colleagues indicated today, there is actually quite a shortage of water management specialists that have the ability to go and actually enforce, measure, regulate, and make sure that many of the existing laws can be enforced. And then down to more of the community-based level on the right-hand side here, you can see that the community-based councils and organizations, as well as the administrative and institutions that support, really are going through that process of decentralization, but that is not a one-time enterprise. It's very much a long-term objective and goal. So thinking about water governance and adding the policy scale, very much thinking through my scientific lens, one of the big challenges, of course, I found is that getting communities involved in the management of their own resources is something that already has occurred and is now going to become a pillar of many of the community benefit agreements to look at monitoring and management in the long term. It also has the potential benefit of wage creation and livelihood and employment, as well as environmental conservation. So, as I'd indicated before, sort of at this mid-range or the river basin councils from the experimental watershed scale that we're quite good at and the basin scale that's actually quite new in terms of management, that is decentralized or in that process, but the landscape level or multiple jurisdictions as well as the regional transboundary is one of the most complicated and actually unknown areas in terms of Mongolia's water management today. So what I mean by that is that multiple countries and transboundary issues, many of the pollution legacies or contamination issues that exist affect well beyond Mongolia itself, outside to external borders. And this is managed through bilateral agreements with Russia and China, as well as multilateral environmental agreements with the global community. So just quickly, an overview. In terms of thinking about international river basins and what that means for Mongolia, there are three predominantly, and I won't go through all of the details, but I really will focus on the Arctic Ocean drainage basin into the Selang watershed and some of the conflicts that I've actually seen, and was fortunate enough to work on a project with the United Nations dealing with mercury contamination coming from a historic mining site and the conflict that it caused with the government of Russia. So focusing on transboundary agreements with Russia, drainage basins shared between Mongolia and Russia cover 31.4% of Mongolia's territory. Mongolia really aims for international cooperation between transboundary waters, but we've actually seen that there's been very few incidences or cases of conflict between neighboring countries. And it's interesting because in the north, or in northern areas where water is perceived as less of an issue for scarcity, the quality issues and infrastructure is more of a problem with the Russian Federation, whereas the opposite of that is with China really thinking about water scarcity and groundwater as surface resources as they're dwindling in the Gobi has become a primary concern. As a disclaimer, I'm not speaking about China today. That's not to say that it isn't equally as important. I just know more about the northern case. So the Selang River Basin is one of the most important agreements, primarily because it was Mongolia's first. Originally started in 1905, was renegotiated with the USSR in 1974, and the Selang River Basin is of huge industrial importance for both countries, and this is one of the reasons why it's become a hot topic and a potential point of conflict. So the government of Mongolia and Russia in 1995 also galvanized this beyond the Selang River Basin, extending to additional jurisdictions, but this basin especially seems to be a real focal area of cooperation between the two governments. And as I'll get to, conflicts have arisen particularly with the impacts of mining. So Sara earlier actually showed the same map here, but we can just see where Ulan Bator is here, and the drainage basin actually flows north all the way up into the Arctic drainage basin. So this is not only an issue of bilateral conflict, but an international waters issue, because the drainage basin does actually go all the way up into the Arctic Ocean. So a quick overview, this project that I'm mentioning here was facilitated through funding from the Global Environmental Facility, the Government of Mongolia, the Government of Korea, and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, who I worked with as a strategic advisor to design and implement this project. It was just the remediation and the approach of this project terminated as of last year that I could provide more information about later if you're interested, but in the sake of time, I'll just have a high-level overview. So the issue of historic mercury contamination in the Boro River Basin is actually started back in 1913 with a German-Russian-Mongolian joint venture that was doing large-scale gold mining and silver mining using mercury as an amalgamation to process the gold. So basically, how that occurs is the same way that salt dissolves in water, gold dissolves in mercury and actually reduces the impurities. So it's an efficient, but unfortunately very toxic and polluting processing technique. And so Mangalore operated in the river basin area, now known as Mandalsum, in Selang. And there was an accident, a horrible accident in 1956 that released upwards of 10,000 tons of mercury into the region. Unfortunately, this is still seen as one of the worst environmental contamination issues that's ever occurred in Mongolia and has been a priority of the government ever since. There were initiatives launched in the early 60s, as well as in 2008 and 2009, to really address and implement a decontamination campaign, both of mercury and cyanide. But after 60 years, this is a legacy that we see still continues to affect river systems and poses direct threats to human health and the environment. So the mercury legacy actually became quite a hot topic, not only at local levels, but as well with the government of Russia, primarily as well because Mongolia's worst environmental contamination case started to affect or was concerned about affecting Lake Baikal. And Lake Baikal is one of the largest environmental issues in Russia today. So an overview is basically what happened was this legacy and the large-scale mining, as we discuss it, created an impact for small-scale artisanal miners and the ninja miners that actually we saw a wave and an influx coming into this area. So when we think about issues of scale, the large-scale mining sector in these unfortunate circumstances actually created a huge influx of the artisanal mining community. And just as a bit of a picture of what it is I'm talking about, basically at the global scale, anthropogenic mercury emissions from the artisanal and small-scale gold mining sector are now the actual largest supply and demand, representing 1,500 tons going into the environment. Mongolia has been very active in the Minamata Convention on Mercury from its original signing in 2013, and I was fortunate enough to work with the Ministry of Environment on this issue and remediating the Boro floodplain. The only reason that we got so much support galvanized for that project was because of the transboundary issue. And because I think I'm out of time, essentially this is just basically a very, very important step forward in terms of global environmental stewardship, and Mongolia is leading that charge. So when we talk very much about the local, regional, and global issues, from mining contamination, mercury continues to be a legacy effect as mercury is not created or destroyed, but just changes form, and the Mongolian government has been incredibly proactive in this area. So final conclusions, just briefly, is that the complex process and the political ecology of water, the decentralization process, and actually supporting regional cooperation is very much a process ongoing. And I think that although there has been a lot of progress made recently, there are a number of opportunities or modalities to continue regional cooperation. Unfortunately, there's very limited research on transboundary conflicts with Mongolia, particularly with China, as well as Russia. And so I hope that provided an overview of some of these issues, and I look forward to answering your questions later. Okay, so I'll let you. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristen, for this really interesting talk. We're going to move on with a talk by Orhon Miadar, who is an assistant professor at the School of Geography and Development in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Arizona. As a political geographer, she's especially interested in the questions of power, ideology, mobility, and identity within the context of shifting political landscapes. Today, she would be talking about digging, with a talk entitled Digging Deeper Beyond the Resource Nationalism Label.
Thank you all, especially organizers of this conference, and thank you all for being here. So about 10 years ago, I wrote my dissertation on imaginary nomads, where I tried to problematize this widespread notion that Mongolia is conceived as the land of fenceless land of nomads. And then there I try to critique the Western notion of Mongolia as this really poetic other, where nomads roam free, and it's the romantic land, it's primitive. And then also I try to juxtapose that Mongolian projection of Mongolia is the land of nomads, and where we routinely stage this primitivity. But 10 years forward now, we're talking about Mongolia is this land of big mining boom, and land of very problematic ecological system, pollution and all. So in my dissertation, I talked about mining just in passing, but I didn't think I would come back to this topic again in full scale. So today I'm gonna talk about mining politics, but not through a scientific lens like the way some of you did, which was really fascinating. So I'm going to intersect a couple of theories here. One is resource nationalism. The other one is, who I will be referring quite often, is accumulation by disposition by David Harvey. So as you all know, many of you are already so familiar with the topic that some of the little bit details may bore you, but I will just go ahead and go through the outline I have here. So resource politics have been one of the most contested political and economic issues in Mongolia. While the nation is endowed with rich natural resources, the appropriation of these resources has been a target of, as you all know, contentious politics in Mongolia. The concept of resource nationalism has been widely used to reflect this ongoing tension surrounding deals over mining rights in Mongolia. So various studies have noted that low-income countries such as Mongolia typically are not equally situated at the negotiation table with capital and technology-rich multinational firms. As such, these countries often live with contracts that are not necessarily in the best interest of those countries. In Mongolia's case, the country made deals that were perceived as unfair to a domestic audience and sought to renegotiate the terms to the chagrin of foreign companies and their national patrons. When the government or public pushed for a greater share of the resources, the concept of resource nationalism has emerged as an alarm for foreign investors. The Oyo-Tolgoi Agreement is the signature deal that reflects this contradiction of global capitalism and local interest. The Oyo-Tolgoi joint venture owns the mining rights to the world's largest and highest grade copper and gold deposits in the South Gobi Desert of Mongolia and has been at the center of turbulent mining politics in Mongolia. This mega 6.6 billion mine is expected to contribute as much as 30% of Mongolia's GDP when it's fully operational. In October 2009, a couple of years after I finished my dissertation, after long negotiation lasting over 6 years, the Mongolian government finally signed the OT investment agreement with the Anglo-Australian miner Rio Tinto and Canada's Ivanhoe mines, resulting in Rio Tinto owning 66% share and the Mongolian government possessing the remaining 34%. And despite numerous public protests against the Oyo-Tolgoi deal, the government's effort and the community's complaints have been labeled as resource nationalism, therefore effectively silenced. So what's resource nationalism? At least the way I see it, resource nationalism is not a neutral term that objectively captures the sentiments of various parties whose interests are impacted by the extractive industries. Rather, it is used precisely and intentionally because it has certain resonance and can marginalize domestic claims to favorable terms of trade and foreign investment. If you think about the term nationalism, actually Dave and I talked about it yesterday, but if you think about the term nationalism, in general, in my mind, signals disruption of harmony and peace in otherwise coherent, wholesome, homogeneous society. For example, the label nationalist carries the particular nuance to evoke same kind of feelings associated with racism, separatism, xenophobia, or otherwise somewhat toxic political aspirations. Is often relegated to the political actions on the fringe. And if you think about Quebec's nationalist, if you think about whenever you reference someone as being nationalist, it's typically a negative term. Some people embrace it in social nationalism, but for the most part, it has this somewhat negative resonance to it. Resource nationalism has thus become a shorthand device to sensationalize the looming danger associated with attempts by governments and local communities to curtail the power and control of multinational energy and mining companies over the domestic natural resources. Echoing this sentiment, it came out a couple of years ago. Ernst & Young's annual report ranked resource nationalism as the #1 risk for mining companies around the world. And of course, Mongolia was referenced repeatedly. In this sense, the term resource nationalism functions like a rhetorical device to discredit policy proposals, not necessarily on their merits, but by linking them to perceived narrow-minded reactionary disposition. It also threatens to silence public grievances against extractive industry practices and could discredit politicians who rally on their behalf. But that's not to say, though, such rhetoric may be employed as a tool by domestic leaders, who I think they do, to gain more favorable negotiating posture vis-a-vis industry representatives or even international financial institutions, and may not be employed purely to represent the public interest. And not surprisingly, if you just search the word resource nationalism, it will be always accompanied this really sensationalist warnings, such as gathering storm and political risk, energy, weapon, and self-defeating, and battle between national interests and foreign influence. These sentiments emerge from neoliberal anxieties regarding state control of property and natural resources, are thus employed most typically by those who benefit from the, in my mind, neoliberal regime most: extractive industry representatives, financial institutions, and other advocates of free markets and privatization. By serving this narrow interest, such discourse may delegitimize efforts of individuals and local governments to seek greater share of the country's natural resources and limit the negative consequences on the environment, and they're reinforcing the cycle of accumulation by dispossession inherent in contemporary global capitalism. So to understand this dialectic of dispossession and accumulation in the context of resource politics in Mongolia, it's helpful to contextualize global capitalism in general and the role of neoliberal policies specifically. In his influential work, The New Imperialism, David Harvey critiques neoliberal global capitalism in which accumulation by dispossession has been a central outcome. As he argues, the dialectic of the market economy has produced overaccumulation of wealth on one hand and extreme poverty on the other hand across the world. And of course, the basic premise of Harvey's theory is based and expanded upon Marx's concept of primitive accumulation. This dialectical method is helpful to understand the overall integrated totality of global capitalism and its neoliberal premise. According to Harvey, neoliberalism is the theory of political economic practices which proposes that human well-being can be best advanced by the maximization of entrepreneurial freedoms within an institutional framework characterized by private property rights, individual liberty, free markets, and free trade, end of quotation. But while the neoliberal agenda often bears benevolent theme, it has not produced a harmonious state in which everyone is better off. Beyond the benevolent facade, neoliberal policies produce a new form of hegemony. Unlike the totalitarian regimes which Mongolia went through, where the state functions as the central engine of control and power, in the new form of global capitalism, it's increasingly the wealthy few corporations or who have simultaneously accumulated unparalleled power. This contradiction, according to Harvey, is the primary contradiction to be confronted. In the case of Mongolia, the country, if you go back to early 90s when Brian was actually incidentally in Mongolia, and I was a first-year college student, and I just vividly remember this time. So the country had been plunged in a state of uncertainty and turmoil following the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Comintern, as Dave talked about yesterday, on whose assistance Mongolia had been largely dependent. At this particular time in history, of course, many of you remember, international agent showed up in Mongolia with the promise to help, but of course, the aid was not attached to any condition. There were a lot of conditions attached to it. Much promised aid, including so-called Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and regional development banks, which played a substantial role in the reordering of the social priorities of Mongolia. Membership in these institutions paved the way for Mongolia to seek and gain various loans and financial, which Mongolia really desperately needed at the time. But again, it subjected Mongolia to various conditions, and then we went through what's typically referred as shock therapy. So, for instance, the donor agencies promised financial aid on adherence to an implementation of package of reforms blueprinted by the agencies. The purported aim of these reforms was to emancipate the Mongolian economy from the political and structural cage of a centrally planned economy. It was assumed that the market economy would generate growth and bring a bright economic future to Mongolia, which in turn would solve social and welfare problems. But But fast forward 20 years, some of the problems still plaguing the country. Despite the promised political stability and economic prosperity, the spoon-fed reform policies have brought social cavities such as deepening inequality, increasing poverty, and deteriorating social welfare, which have undermined the very thesis of the reform in the country. As a result of these macroeconomic policies and disinvestment in the public sector, Mongolia suffered from extreme poverty and growing gap between the wealthy and poor, and crumbling physical and social infrastructure. Again, as someone who was growing up in Mongolia during the social period, there was some disparity, but not in the scale that we can see. And if you look at the poorest and the richest in Mongolia, it's a remarkable gap. Within this context, resource politics in Mongolia have been largely dictated by the overall structural disposition. While the country is endowed with rich natural resources, whether the country will fare better or worse is really hard to speculate. Certainly, it's plausible that the resources will bring an economic miracle, which has happened across the world, countries like Australia, Canada, and Qatar, Norway, and there have been examples of such measured reliance on natural resource can prompt economic growth and contribute to social infrastructure. Yet it remains equally plausible that this natural wealth may undermine the country's sustainable development by distracting government attention away from smaller scale or local industry endeavors, creating instead resource curves from which many countries unfortunately have suffered again around the world. So proponents of this extractive industry argue that exploiting natural resources help a country's economy by creating employment for a large number of people, bringing diversified incomes to rural people, contributing to the local economy by generating income through taxes and other indirect sources. So as you saw from Sara's presentation, and if you look at it from the at a glance, it seems like it's happening. There's lots of people are coming to this big mining boom areas, and then they come with employment and so on. But when you dig a little deeper, there are problems. The share of mining in Mongolia GDP today stands at 20% roughly, and doubling the rate from a decade ago. Of course, Mongolia was going through an extreme boom a couple of years ago, which recorded double-digit growth, which of course went down in response to this turbulent politics, specifically to do with the OT deal. So when the OT agreement was signed in 2009, there was widespread hope and promise that this project would bring prosperity and lift the country out of poverty, where currently approximately 1 in every 3 people lives under the poverty line. The OT assured that the Mongolian government will receive majority of the profits from the project with no financial risk. But behind the rosy promises, however, critics argue that mining-related benefits arguably helped the country in the short run. The social and environmental prices paid can be unparalleled, and many are irreversible. So beyond the obvious social and environmental consequences, dependence on and mismanagement of natural resources may entail indeed a resource curse. Mining companies obtain wealth from extracting the natural resources, while the local communities bear lasting costs associated with mining practices, including the destruction of their immediate environment, as we've heard over and over again throughout this conference, and then social economic devastation that follows. So again, there are so many mining operations in Mongolia, and OT is one of the focus. But as we heard, the artisanal mining industry also should be subject to the same scrutiny. But OT is just in scale, in significance, unparalleled. So when the government of Mongolia signed the agreement in 2009, the world growth of Mongolia said that the OT provisions were balanced and fair by financial market and industry standards. But public opinion has been contrary. Many Mongolians perceive that 34-66 split as unfair, as indicated by the survey conducted by Sant Marat Foundation, According to Marot, over 80% of respondents believe that Mongolia should hold the majority of OT ownership. Within that 80% of people, 25% indicating it should be solely owned by Mongolia. And again, of course, Mongolian government has tried to revisit the agreement, but then OT muscled its way and then stalled the project, and then eventually Mongolian government came to the negotiating table, and then now the project is going forward. The generally revisiting deal is considered morally questionable at best and despicable at worst, as the burden is unfairly placed on those who have less power and wealth. And again, it's not an isolated case, and all over the world, lots of countries have been charged with arbitration at the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, like Argentina, Algeria, Russia, Venezuela, all those countries. But aside from the national politics surrounding OT deal, local communities live in that surrounding areas have expressed broad range of concerns, and then many environmental groups have done very comprehensive studies, and then the themes are consistent. So they record some of the, I think Sara's work is really important about the dust, and then population migration to the area, which infrastructure is not suited to have this rapid influx of people, and then unemployment is one of the key issues, where local, instead of hiring people from the local area, they prefer to bring people from somewhere else for various different reasons, and so on. So it's been complicated, to say the least. So I think I'm going to cut through and go through my conclusion. Yes. So Harvey warns that the future is already present in the world around us. Accordingly, Mongolia's future may be murky in spite of the vast natural resources on which the nation is placing much hope. As of now, the riches from these resources have been concentrated among the hands of powerful players, while the general population has assumed, specifically people who are around the surrounding areas, has assumed unfair share of the costs associated with such disproportionate accumulation, resulting from, in my mind, neoliberal prescriptions. And again, environmental costs of mining are significant. Many opponents fear that natural resources are plundered to serve the needs of rich countries, but will fail to offer sustainable revenue and jobs that will lift the long-term trajectory of the quality of life. Mongolia's promise of mining riches have not silenced the concerns of the local communities, nor has it settled public perception that the majority of the shares of strategic mining should belong to Mongolia. And again, just to go back, the resource nationalism has been used to generalize all efforts of developing countries to exert greater control over their natural resources, including capturing greater share of their wealth generated by the extraction and limiting the role of foreign companies in shaping domestic environmental policy as dangerous attempts to foment a xenophobic nationalism. When the imbalance between accumulation and dispossession is contested, resistance is formidable. So, of course, Harvey suggests that at some point, this democratic collective management structure might be ideal, but again, we don't know. Right now, as I speak, 10 years from now, when I give my another presentation, I don't know what I will be giving a presentation on, but that's it.
Thank you very much, Orhan. And our third and last speaker is Olaf Jensen. Is that right? So he's an assistant professor in the Department of Marine and Coastal Sciences at Rutgers University. His research group studies fisheries and aquatic ecosystems, and his work has relied on a combination of mathematical modeling, data synthesis, and field studies in location ranging from the Louisiana salt marsh to coastal New Jersey and Mongolian lakes and rivers. Today he will be giving us a talk with the evocative title of The River Wolf and Blue Pearl.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Frank, and thank you all for coming and for the invitation to come speak here. It's been an incredibly interesting symposium so far. I'm going to talk about work that's the result of a large collaboration of aquatic ecologists, both Mongolian and American, working together in what we call the Mongolian American Aquatic Ecology Research Initiative. And this is a research and training program that has done reciprocal visits between Mongolian scientists to the US and US scientists and students to Mongolia, focusing on understanding Mongolian aquatic ecosystems, particularly the lakes and rivers of Hufsagul province in the north. I'll start out with the river wolf of the title. This is the taimen, Hucho taimen. It is the largest trout or salmon species in the world. They get up to 200 pounds and 6 feet long. This is an iconic species in Mongolia. It's endangered globally, actually listed as threatened on the IUCN Red List. But Mongolia has some of the last remaining quite healthy populations of this species in the north. It's a species found uniquely in rivers, almost uniquely in rivers. There's just a few lakes in the world where they're found. And there are rapidly developing recreational fisheries for this species in Mongolia. These tend to be high-end recreational fisheries using fly fishing. It's a catch-release only species in Mongolia. There's no legal harvest of this species. And those fisheries do bring a significant economic benefit to rural areas in Mongolia. The going rate for one fisherman to fish for this species is about $5,000 to $6,000 a week. So a significant amount of money coming in, but it's also an endangered species, which raises a lot of questions about how sustainable this is as an ecotourism initiative. Taimen are also at the top of the food chain, and as such, they're interesting from the point of view of being an umbrella species. That's the concept of a species for which, if you conserve them, if you conserve all of the habitat and the prey that they need, you're likely to have benefits for other species as well. They provide a conservation umbrella that provides broader protection. This is the Egg River in northern Mongolia. You've seen several photos of this river throughout the presentations here, and it is the site of one of the healthiest populations of taimen in Mongolia. It's part of the Egg Ore watershed. The Egg River starts in Lake Hufsagul, which is the 19th largest lake in the world by volume and Mongolia's largest freshwater source. The Egg River flows out of Hufsagul into the Salang, which then becomes the major tributary of Lake Baikal in Russia. Taimen in Mongolia and aquatic ecosystems more broadly in Mongolia face a variety of threats. We've heard about many of them throughout the talks in this symposium, starting with urbanization and lack of water treatment, particularly in the areas around several of Mongolia's largest cities. Mining, certainly a threat as well. Overfishing in some areas, despite the fact that Mongolia classifies taimen as strictly a catch-release species, there is illegal fishing that happens in many places. And overgrazing as well. We've talked about that a bit as a threat to terrestrial environments, but overgrazing is also a threat for the rivers and lakes in Mongolia, partly because the removal of vegetation from the land surface results in runoff and siltation of the rivers. So overgrazing is a threat beyond just the terrestrial environment there. So the initial work that our group did in Mongolia focused on taimen was looking at fishing impacts and fishery management, trying to figure out whether a sustainable recreational fishery could be developed for taimen, and secondarily looking at taimen movements, so the movements of individual fish within the river with respect to this idea of developing concession areas. Concession areas would be sections of the river that are essentially leased out to individual companies, which would have, therefore, as the theory goes, an incentive to conserve these areas. This is an idea that was pushed quite strongly by the World Bank. Not surprisingly, the idea of privatizing the river appealed to them. It did not go over so well within Mongolia, not surprisingly as well. And it's also not an idea that's terribly appealing here in the U.S. We don't do this with our rivers here. It is a strategy used quite widely within Western Europe. So looking at the impacts of fishing, we started out from a point of very little knowledge about this species within Mongolian waters, partly because of their rarity, but also because of the lack of previous studies on the species there. So we needed to gather first information about growth of this species in this location. We also had to borrow information from the same species in other parts of the world. We conducted a 4-year mark recapture study to estimate the size of the taimen population in this area. That's catching fish, marking them with these small plastic tags that have an individual number, and recapturing them later. And that allows you to estimate the overall size of the population. We borrowed a lot of information from other species. In particular, there's a strong trade-off between growing fast and living long. You can do one or the other if you're a fish, but you can't do both. So if we know something about growth, we can also infer something about their longevity. And finally, looking at movements and the mortality suffered by fish that are caught and released using radio telemetry. It turns out that the mortality rates of released fish in this fishery are quite low, on the order of 5 to 10% of individuals end up dying from the experience of being caught and released. So a relatively low rate of release mortality. For estimating growth, since this is officially listed as an endangered species on the Mongolian Red List, we did not want to kill them, which is a challenge for fish biologists because a lot of what we learn about fish growth comes from looking at the inner ear bone, the otolith. So that's a picture of the otolith there on the right-hand side. Since we didn't want to kill them, we made use of fish that we found naturally, either washed up dead on the shore or taken from poachers, confiscated from poachers. This is one example here on the left. That larger fish on the right-hand side there is a 1.5 meter taimen that was found dead on the riverbank with a 90 centimeter taimen sticking out of its mouth, obviously its last meal. If you'll believe it, when we opened up that smaller taimen, there was a 40 centimeter fish within its gut, so sort of like the Russian nesting dolls, also indicative of the high level of cannibalism within this species. So Amy's talk mentioned that you can use the rings in trees to understand patterns in the past. Well, you can use the rings in the fish otolith in a similar manner to understand growth of the species. They lay down a characteristic light and dark band within this otolith so that you count the number of bands and you arrive at the fish's age. So with that information, we combined it with an estimate of the population size, which turned out to be about 19 adult fish per kilometer of river, and put that all together in a mathematical model that allowed us to estimate the impacts of different fishing scenarios on the taimen population. So these are some of those results here. All of these are scaled relative to no fishing. So a value of 1 up at the top there would indicate no impact whatsoever compared to no fishing. And we looked at 3 scenarios. In blue, the existing fishery as it is operated now, which is 100% catch-release with 5 to 10% mortality. A recreational fishery that had no release, so a recreational fishery in which all of those fish were caught and killed. That's an extreme case to look at in contrast. And then finally, a hypothetical commercial fishery operated so that it achieved what we call maximum sustainable yield. That would be a fishery that was really focused not on the recreational side, but on feeding people and selling those fish. What we see is that the existing recreational fishery has very little impact on the total weight, numbers, average weight, or survival of the fish. That's probably because of the relatively small scale of the fishery and the high survival rates of released fish. In contrast, a recreational fishery in which those fish were kept of the same size would have substantial impacts, and a commercial fishery would be relatively devastating to this population and would also not be compatible with the existence of this high-end recreational fishery. If the survival to age 10, which is about trophy size, is reduced by 70%, you wouldn't be able to charge $6,000 a week for people to come fish there. So you'd have one or the other as options. So looking at taimen movements, I mentioned that we did radio telemetry. So these tags are about the size of your thumb, And we catch taimen and put them under sedation and then do a small operation where we insert one of these tags. And that allows us then for the next 6 years or so to track that fish's movements as it travels throughout the river. So as we did this, we were able to construct these diagrams indicating the home range, the movements of individual fish. And you can see, first of all, that there's quite a bit of individual variation. So a typical fish on the top left over there might have a home range size of about 10 kilometers. But we saw fish that were undergoing much longer migrations outside of that area. And indeed, some fish on the lower right there, where they simply got up and moved their home range to an entirely different part of the river. So an incredible amount of variation at the individual level. When we finished the study, we were quite content that we'd described the home range of the taimen, and we had movements up to 90 kilometers. And then, of course, we did a new study, which is always a mistake when you've got nice, clean results. So we did this new study in an area of the river that's more than 150 kilometers downstream from this area. And I was out there this past summer with my field technician, and we recovered a fish with our radio antenna and saw the number for that fish. Each of the fish has an individual number, and neither of us recognized the number. And so when we got back and looked at the data, it turns out it was a fish that we had tagged 2 years previously in what we thought was an entirely different study area, 150 kilometers upstream. So these individual fish are undergoing enormous movements within the river. So just to sum up some of the management implications of this work, the existing fishery is probably a very good trade-off between bringing some much needed revenue to rural areas with relatively little impact on the taimen population. So this is compatible with conservation. In fact, I suspect that, I don't have data on this, but I suspect that it ends up being a net positive for the taimen population, because what most of these fishing companies do is they also pay for local rangers to increase patrols in the area. So I suspect they're also decreasing poaching rates as well, although we don't have any data on that. If we look at the economics, a hypothetical commercial fishery makes no sense whatsoever, even if you're willing to give up the conservation side. The money is just completely incommensurate. You'd make about $10,000 to $20,000 a year selling the fish, as opposed to $300,000 to $500,000 a year selling the fish to fishermen to catch and then release back into the river. The movement rates suggest that spatial management, if it's going to occur, should be happening at very large spatial scales. So if something like concession areas or protected areas were developed, if you want those to have a real effect on the population, they should be at scales of over 100 kilometers, given the types of movement rates we've seen. So I want to switch now to a threat that was mentioned before, which I think is really going to be, over the longer term, a critical problem for Mongolia's taimen populations, as well as their other unique fish species. And that's climate change. So Alicia had asked the question before about whether there are any positives to climate change, and certainly some species will benefit from climate change in Mongolia. Unfortunately, those species are the cosmopolitan species. They're the pigeons or Norway rats or cockroaches of the fish world. The unique species in Mongolia, fish like the taimen, are likely to be threatened quite substantially by climate change. If we look at the temperatures that we've seen on the river there just over the past 1 year period from 2011 to 2012, they frequently now in the summer get up above a value of 18 degrees Celsius, which tends to be close to the thermal limit for species in the trout and salmon family. So they're routinely now experiencing periods of up to a couple weeks where temperatures are extremely stressful for the species. To look at that and to understand the likely long-term implications, we've been doing respirometry experiments to understand the bioenergetics of this species and of other unique species like the lennik, the Asian trout. And what we see is that metabolism in general follows a quite characteristic exponential increase with temperature. So as the fish get closer to their thermal limits, you see each degree increase in temperature having a larger impact on metabolism. That means that for every degree increase in temperature, the fish has to eat that much more just to maintain its own weight. want to shift now to talking about a area further upstream from the Egg River, the source of the Egg River, Mongolia's Blue Pearl, Lake Hufsagul. This is an iconic place in Mongolia, a place that is of enormous cultural importance, enormous importance as a water resource, and actually a very unique lake globally. Lake Hufsagul, as I mentioned, is the 19th largest lake in the world by volume, and it is one of the most nutrient-poor lakes in the world, and that makes it quite unique in terms of the water clarity. Typically, we measure water clarity, limnologists do, using a black and white disc about this big, and you drop it down until you can't see it anymore, and that tells you something about water clarity. Well, when we do that on Lake Hufsagul, frequently the disc disappears, not because of the water clarity, but because it's gotten so far down that it's too tiny to see anymore. So we have frequently water clarities exceeding 18 meters of what we call the Secchi depth, which is definitely on the extreme high end for water clarity. Lake Hufsagul is also a very interesting place for me as an American ecologist to come and study climate change. We've heard quite a bit about how climate change is proceeding very rapidly in Mongolia. That's certainly the case in this region as well. And Lake Hufsagul is, as we thought when we started working there, relatively pristine compared to many other places. I live in New Jersey, and if I wanted to understand the effects of climate change on our rivers, I would have to separate the effects of climate change from the effects of 100 years of factories on those rivers, from introduced invasive species, from everything else that's going on. And it's simply impossible to tease apart all of those different effects. Whereas we can use Lake Hufsagul as a model ecosystem for predicting the kinds of changes that we might see elsewhere around the world as climate change proceeds. To do that, we've been doing a variety of limnological sampling on Lake Hufsagul in this interesting vessel that was actually dragged overland from Lake Baikal in the winter to Lake Hufsagul, and it certainly looks like it when you get on it. We've been doing hydroacoustics, which is fish sonar, basically beaming sound down into the lake and looking at the echoes to understand fish populations below the levels where you can see them. We've used a variety of different nets to sample those fish and plankton directly. And we've used a variety of physical sampling instruments to sample the physical characteristics of the water and the chemistry. And I'll just quickly go over some of the results. It's always an interesting combination of high technology. That's a $100,000 echo sounder there being held up and weighted by rocks. So we make do with what we have once we get out into the field. So we've used a very interesting chemical technique looking at the stable isotope ratios of carbon and nitrogen within fish tissues as a way of tracking the movement of energy through a food web. And when we applied that to Lake Hufsagul, it was quite interesting. The x-axis here is carbon, and that tells you something about whether the carbon that an individual fish or a population of fish is eating comes from zooplankton and phytoplankton originally, that is plankton produced within the lake, or if it comes from benthic sources. So that would be plants growing from the bottom of the lake. The y-axis here is the nitrogen stable isotopes, and that tells you where in the food web a particular fish sits. If it's high in the nitrogen stable isotope ratio, it means it's at the top of the food chain. Two things are of interest here. One is that Lake Hufsagul sits, most of the fish populations sit quite far to the right, indicating that they're supported by benthic production. That's unusual relative to other large lakes. And it's probably in part because of the extreme water clarity and the low nutrient content in Lake Hufsagul, driving a lot of benthic production and relatively little production within the water column itself. The other thing to notice is that all of these fish populations are kind of smashed together in the vertical space, indicating that there's no clear separation between the top predators and fish that are further down on the food chain. It turns out that they share a lot of common food resources, which perhaps also relates to the fact that Lake Hufsagul is so nutrient poor that even the top predators must rely on smaller food items than they typically would elsewhere. So I mentioned using Lake Hufsagul as a model ecosystem, and right away that idea is starting to fall apart as we look at this relationship here between ecosystem size, that's the size of a lake, and the food chain length, that's the number of steps between the plants and the top predators. there's a fairly nice for ecological data relationship between ecosystem size and food chain length, and that black circle there is Lake Hoofsegel. So clearly something else is going on here in Lake Hoofsegel. It's perhaps not indicative of what we might expect in other lakes. I had a graduate student who came out with me in 2013 for the first time, and wanted to do a project on microplastics in Lake Hoofsegel. And of course, I wanted to be encouraging of a new graduate student, but I thought this was a fairly ridiculous idea. This is a lake high up in the watershed. It's relatively pristine. I didn't think he would find much. Well, he did the study, and it turns out that Lake Hoofsegel has levels of microplastic that are as high as in many of the Laurentian Great Lakes in the US and Canada, areas with much greater population density. Also, looking at changes in body size of fish. So since we started our sampling in 2009 at Lake Hoofsegel, we've seen significant declines in body size of several fish species, and that seems to be attributable to the rise of illegal fishing with gill nets in Lake Hoofsegel. So as Lake Hoofsegel develops as a tourist destination, there seems to be growing pressure to do illegal fishing to sell those fish to tourists. It's an emerging market there. I just want to stop with this image here. This is a lovely spot in the lower Egg River, and if you'd like to see it, I recommend getting your tickets now, because this place will be underwater by 2 years from now. This is near the confluence of the Egg and the Seleng, the proposed site of a hydroelectric dam, and that dam will flood a reservoir of approximately 75 kilometers long. So for the last 2 years, my team has been scrambling to get as much pre-dam data as we can to be able to document the impacts of this hydroelectric development. And of course, for an aquatic ecologist to see a change like this is very sad, but it is understandable in terms of trade-offs, in terms of electricity production. We've heard several talks about air pollution in UB from coal-fired power plants. Well, one of the alternatives is hydroelectric power. Russia has objected quite strenuously to this and other dams on in the Selenga watershed. These are objections that ring a little bit hollow when you consider that Russia is currently selling electricity to Mongolia and might not want to lose a customer in this way. In any case, very tough decisions to be made about future energy development in Mongolia and the impacts on aquatic ecosystems. So with that, I just want to acknowledge all of the people who have contributed to this and the various funders. Thank you.
We have about 20 minutes for questions. I would invite the speakers to come to the table. If we could try and have questions that won't take too long, try to be very brief in the questions so that we can fit a few. Yeah, Sara at the back.
Okay. Great. Thank you, everyone, for your talks. Orhan, I had a question for you. I can't see you.
I can't see you either. I'd like to see you.
There you go. I was just wondering if you think reframing resource nationalism as resource sovereignty gets you out of, or gets everyone out of any of this discourse with the especially used by investors.
I think, of course, when I was writing this piece, I honestly, I was not trying to come up with a policy proposal because I'm not trained to do that. But resource sovereignty sounds great, and I think that's something David Harvey would probably go in line with, and that instead of letting these few powerful players accumulate in the cost of everyone else being dispossessed of the resources, I think the going through with the resource sovereignty, I don't know, it sounds to me appealing, but I don't know exactly. I see you shaking your head. So I'm not trained to do this, to be honest, but I'd like to hear more others' opinion.
Just as a follow-up to that, if you look up the definition of resource nationalism, there are two definitions in any dictionary. But we only basically talk about the first definition, which relates to in its economic use of resources. But the second definition, which I feel is closer to how Mongolia views its resource nationalist policy is connected to national security.
Right.
And national security then moves into sovereignty, it moves into the individual country, regardless of which one we're talking about, and how they perceive they should protect the national integrity and sovereignty of the country. So I try to point out when we're in these discussions that you cannot let the economists and the financial planners subsume the whole meaning of resource nationalism. But maybe it's gone too far, and
Right.
we need a new term.
Julian?
I just wanted to make a comment on resource nationalism. It's an English term. In Mongolian, it's not translated. So when I was in the cabinet of Minister Altenhoek, and our cabinet was mostly criticized for our policy of resource nationalism, I remember very vividly the Prime Minister Altenhoek asked me, "Oyungeril, you know English, please translate it to me. What does it mean?" Why we are being criticized for something called resource nationalism. So we tried to translate it in 2 words like it sounds in English, but it wasn't translated. So what does it mean is that in Mongolia, there is no such the whole system or policy or thing called resource nationalism. It's just a journalistic term in media that was used, overused against the policy or criticizing or describing the policies that Mongolian government was, and Mongolian public and local people and the environmentalist was talking about. So it's I agree with the speaker who said that the general idea is usually used negatively in terms of Mongolia, unfairly negatively, I would like to say, because we didn't create this thing. So many ideas and many pluralist ideas all together was nicknamed as resource nationalism.
Easy, right here. As a fisherman, I'm curious as to what you think will be the effect of damming this section of the river that you just showed on the taimen population in the area.
Yeah, it looks like it will probably create a transition from that lower section of the river being habitat for taimen and another endangered salmonid, the lennox, to being habitat for pike and perch, which are globally widespread species, not unique, not endangered. So I think you'll have a trade-off, as we've seen in many other places, between these cosmopolitan species coming up and these unique endemic species going down.
Julian?
Good, thanks. First, a note to Olaf, and I guess to Bill and to Amy as well. You anglers, archaeologists, and lumberjacks have way too much fun. Everyone is always smiling in the photos. We, as social scientists, have to make a concerted effort to have fieldwork pictures of smiling people. You seem to have something figured out. A little bit more seriously, I completely agree with what Oyunga just said and what Ohan has been talking about the strategic use of this label. So my question goes to Kristen. In these transboundary disputes, whether that's with Russia or China, do the Russians or the Chinese ever accuse Mongolia of resource nationalism for water resources? And does that follow the same pattern as that discourse unfolds on mining issues?
Well, that's an excellent question, and the answer is yes. I think that through that lens and really looking at, like Alicia had indicated, the issue of security and also really that perhaps misconception about sovereignty, it is framed in a negative context, but I know that the current hotbed topic as well is actually putting in the dam that you mentioned. And so, that will have a large footprint, on the Mongolian side, but has benefits, of course, for energy autonomy. And, there are a multiple, web of issues, I think, associated with that. But recently, when I've been looking at the Russian media and their response, they're basically highlighting that resource nationalism is one of the reasons. And there's comparatively less information available about the Chinese perspective, in fact, but that's, just more of a classic case of competition for dwindling resources coming from the Gobi.
And this is a question for Olaf Jensen. I wonder if you came across with the term offsetting when you were in Mongolia? Offsetting?
No, sorry.
Okay, so I've heard that the Ministry of Environment, they have this policy of implementing offsetting program. It's
Sorry, offsetting program. Yeah, sorry, I
so
misunderstood.
it's kind of advocated by the World Bank, and the World Bank is trying to, collaborate with the ministry to implement this policy. And then I'm wondering how realistic this kind of policies for this kind of like time and kind of population, is this realistic, or is this some sort of rhetorical, one of those policies?
Yeah,
this kind of question also affects the other kind of, ecological biodiversities. So
I think that's a great question. So carbon offsetting has driven a lot of the expansion of hydroelectric development in Mongolia, but also elsewhere in the world. And I saw a worksheet that was done for the dam in question here on the Egg River that was designed to see whether the dam would be eligible for subsidies under one of these programs. And it essentially had to prove that there was an insufficient market for the electricity that would be generated for this to be done by the private sector. And on the one hand, you can kind of understand the reasoning that there wouldn't be a need to subsidize this if this was actually an economically viable activity. But on the other hand, it's a demonstration of the lack of a need for something like this. And I think it reminds me of a conversation I had a couple of years ago with the director of this hydroelectric project. And he said that in Mongolia, they've come to the idea that solar and wind are not suitable solutions in Mongolia. And I looked at him and said, how did this conclusion come about? And he said, well, there have been several large solar and wind projects, and they've always gone out to bid, and they've gone to the lowest bidder. And that's generally been a Chinese company that's come in and built them to the lowest standard as well. And so they've worked on the day that the keys have been handed over, and they've failed within 6 months to a year after that. And so I think that's a substantial concern here as well for a hydro project, that if you don't have the proper bid specifications, it's not simply an issue of the project not producing electricity. It's potentially a catastrophe for the dam to fail. So yes, there's a whole much larger context in terms of carbon credits and offsets, and this idea of driving hydroelectric construction through our attempt to provide more low carbon electricity.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Hi, this is mostly for Orhan. I was going to push you a little bit further on the resource curse idea. And well, you've been saying that, is that still a potential problem for Mongolia? I'm curious if it's actually already there, that it seems like there's something of an internal brain drain. Some of the most talented people in Mongolia all end up working for OT. I think even, I was going to say, the ACMS director, Enk, is, I think, working there now as well. Yeah, and it seems like other environmental engineers I used to know there have all ended up also with OT. Is that now the problem? And a little bit further, would you say that there's something of Dutch disease happening with the commodity prices for copper being relatively low at this point, maybe mitigating the problem, but otherwise that everything is really concentrated in one sector?
Yeah, it is a problem of countries that are so dependent on natural resources, right? And whenever commodity price fluctuates, the country's economy is so subject to those fluctuating commodity prices. So Mongolia is really dependent on this mining extractive industry. And then with that, Mongolia's economy is very fragile in my mind. And like Alicia mentioned earlier, diversifying economy is critical. But your earlier point about whether Mongolia is already in resource curse, I guess it depends on who you ask. Most of the environmental advocacy groups would say that we are already in that phase. They see the environmental problems are irreversible, and then there's no strong political on the part of the government to address these issues because the economy is, again, very much dependent on the revenues from this mining extractive industry. And then, yeah, to me, again, when I look at it, there's just no perfect solution. Whether you look at it, it's lesser of the two evils kind of situation. And I do agree that a lot of the greatest minds are being recruited by these mining companies, unfortunately, in my mind. But the reality is that that's where they have employment and where they pay slightly higher payment. So,
David, question?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I had a question for Kristen, really, about the river basin organisations and whether the kind of water management that they undertake, is it really to do with granting permits and permissions for new ventures and new water uses, or is there actual kind of active, ongoing management of the water, how much a given swim centre might use for its internal domestic supply and all these things? So I'm a bit curious. Some of those river basin catchment areas were quite vast, and so I was wondering, when it comes right down to the sort of locals actually using water, how much management there really was.
Right. So that's a very good question, and I think it's one of the most complicated challenges that the river basin organizations actually have. Because although, as I said, there's been a push for definitely the last 15 years to try to promote decentralization and decentralized resource management, the challenge is that the capacity of many community levels and individuals in the community, they don't have the appropriate skill set and require vocational training to actually be involved in the monitoring and management of water resources, predominantly looking at water quality. And another challenge as well is that sort of historically community development agreements have not been fairly participatory in terms of mineral concessions and how the community can actually be actively involved in decision making, particularly around water resources. So this is an issue that has been identified. But in terms of compliance, the compliance issue and that regulatory piece and that decision making, that still is actually, not as decentralized as we would like to see. And that's an area that I think has been identified as sort of an opportunity to look at with the new post-2015 development agenda and the sustainable development goals. There's actually a big focus now, and it was in Toronto last week and had the opportunity to speak with some representatives from the Mongolian government discussing exactly this point of what will that look like, particularly because there are new community benefit or community development agreements coming in. And so they're actually hoping that now that that's enshrined in law, that this is an area where we'll actually be able to really engage the local communities to be more involved in that decision-making and long-term management process.
We have time for a tiny follow-up question. Okay, so I was a bit curious, actually, as to the sort of main reasons for that sort of policy towards decentralization. I mean, quite how does a community manage its own water? I mean, a community is kind of a fantasy. I mean, we have this notion of some sort of homogenous group of people who share a common interest and come together and do stuff in a nice kind of consensual way. But I mean, every place I've been to, including Mongolia and Britain and other places, you actually just get social networks. They can stretch from the capital to the locality with one set of people. They may share some interests, but not many with other people who are their neighbors. And I mean, so how could a community manage its own water?
Well, I think that co-management is more realistic than having a full community-based resource management approach in Mongolia, primarily because many communities are migratory or nomadic. So having a long-term monitoring in an area that you may or may not return to on an annual basis is an inherent challenge. I think that one challenge as well was with the Colloquially, it's known, the law with the very long name, that came in 2009, and it was enshrined in that law that you must have community participation in long-term monitoring efforts. But I think that although that was a well-intentioned piece of legislation, it also invalidated over 4,000 mining licenses with the potential concessions, because you were no longer allowed to mine anywhere within 500 meters or up to a kilometer of any river. And because of the gold deposits, alluvial and eluvial, in Mongolia, it caused just a huge issue where it actually politicized the issue of water so much that communities we started seeing reacting in a really negative way and almost having a localized blowback of resource nationalism. So I guess to answer your question, I think that it's a long-term goal, but in Mongolia's case, because of the low population density, that there's always going to have to be some sort of co-management model. And yeah, full decentralization, I don't think, is maybe fully realistic.
I think we're going to break for lunch and reconvene at 2. Before I thank all the speakers, I was asked to make an announcement. For the non-speakers, we have a selection of restaurant options around the campus, and you'll find them on the table over there. And for the speakers, and then you just follow me, and I'll follow Jenny because I don't know where we're going. And so I'll thank the 3 speakers who gave really, really fascinating talks. Thank you.